Hi, Erin, and kia ora to everybody. I'm Caroline Bowditch, and I am the CEO at Arts Access Victoria, and I'm coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people in the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and all of the traditional owners of the lands that you are coming from, and that might be joining us today. I extend my respects. I am coming to you also from my home office in Melbourne. We are still, although lots of people think that for some reason, lots of people think the pandemic is over, it very definitely isn't, and it's still having a massive impact on our community, and we're still very much working in and out of our office. So today I'm in my home office. I am a white 50-something woman today wearing gold-rimmed glasses. I have kind of brownie lipstick and a blue top, and I am proudly sitting in my power wheelchair, although you can't really see that on screen. I am a very proud disabled person, and I think coming to a space of disability pride has been a lifetime in coming. It's not something that has, I guess it's something that we grow to know and learn. And I too am learning to have more disability pride every day. For those of you that don't know Arts Access Victoria, we are based in Melbourne, and we have been around since 1974. So we are fast approaching our 50th anniversary, which feels kind of extreme and great. And I would say in that 50 years, the organisation has hugely evolved. We are now disability-led. I came into this role in 2018, and in its 45-year history at that point, it was the first time that Arts Access had actually been led by a visibly and openly, publicly disabled person, which felt really significant and important to have that authentic leadership. I'd seen authentic leadership very much actively engaged in the UK, but it's something that in Australia we were still and are still growing into, I would say. We support over 1,500 deaf and disabled artists every year to get closer to their ambitions or their artistic ambitions, and our vision really is for cultural equity for deaf and disabled people. We are in the process of defining what that is, and gradually, hopefully, getting closer to it. And our real purpose or our mission is to have transformational and systemic, or bring about or lead transformational and systemic change in the arts and cultural spaces here in Victoria. So I wanted to really begin talking today just to give you some context and some cultural context of where disability sits specifically within Australia and within Victoria, but lots of these things can be applied, I would say, across the board. And the first thing I would say is that we are not all equal. We like to think that we live in an equal society, but we don't. As disabled people, we live in a world that reinforces a belief that being non-disabled is preferable and is the default position. So we assume that everyone is non-disabled, when actually we know that 20% of the population, around 20%, could identify as being disabled. We live in a world that views disabled people as somehow lesser beings. We are assumed to be of lesser value. And we, again, saw that really play out through the pandemic. There were some amazing statistics that came out of the UK that indicated that 2/3 of the COVID deaths were of disabled people. And that was something that we didn't document in Australia because for some reason that was potentially seen as not being important to measure. But for us, it's really significant. And we also live in a world that suggests that we are problematic, inconvenient, and best avoided. And I think this is the thought that really reinforces ableism. And we'll talk more about ableism and what it is in a second. But basically, I live in a world that was not built with me in mind. And every day I negotiate that. And I negotiate that in my environment, but I also negotiate that in terms of the systems and the structures within which we all operate and function. We know that the arts sector currently prioritizes access for non-disabled people. We think about access as a bolt-on, as a thing that we add at the end if we've got time and money to add it in often. And I think we've just had a festival here in Melbourne called Alter State, which was a collaboration between Arts Centre Melbourne and Arts Access Victoria that was disability-led, that has its foundations built on the wisdom of the wonderful Rodney Bell and Carly Finlay and Joshua Pether. All they were the artists that really built built the foundations for the festival to happen. But as a festival, we built with access at the centre, and we built it out. So it wasn't an optional extra; it was absolutely built into everything we do. And I think, we need to be moving much more to that place. Access is still seen as an optional extra. And actually it needs to be seen as a prioritised essential. So I define ableism as being the disability equivalent of racism. It's a term that I use to describe the prejudice and discrimination experienced by people either directly or indirectly. So it can be very obvious in terms of people can blatantly discriminate against you in terms of potentially employment. But then there's also this undercurrent that is much more hidden and is much more indirect, which is where we build ableism into our systems. And that is much more indirect discrimination. I think one of the things that fascinates me is that disability is an open enrollment group. Everybody is welcome and anyone can join the gang at any time. So we know that around 17% of people are born with a disability. Most people acquire their disability. And the longer we live, the more likely we are to experience disability at some point in our lives. But disability has been and always will be present as long as humans exist on this earth. But we seem to think that it's something that happens to other people. And we also view it as the worst thing that could ever happen to someone in their life, and something that is best avoided if possible. And that in itself, as a thought, as a concept, and that is the way that disability is presented a lot through our popular culture as being something that is bad. It's not seen, it's very rarely seen as something that is a positive, that is just a different way to live a life. And I'm sure you've heard lots of disabled people say this in the past, but I would not be the person that I am if I was not disabled. And I am very proud to be a disabled person. I have an incredible life, but from the outside, people wouldn't necessarily perceive that. And I think we need to be addressing that. Those sorts of attitudes about disability is best avoided. And I know that in Aotearoa, you've got this beautiful concept that Rodney taught me about how we lean into the wind, how you lean into the wind. And I really love that as a thought. It's just about we all lean into the wind, and we do that differently. I love that as a concept. But we do live in a world that where our lives and our worth to the world is based or measured based on our productivity. And there is an assumption that disabled people are somehow less productive than others. And I think that comes from this concept that we are the ones that are absorbing from a system rather than offering to a system. Any disabled person that requires any support staff becomes an employer. They also probably are a manager of more than one support staff. But rarely do we ever think about disabled people as managers of their lives or of a team of people. We just kind of don't necessarily get that into our head. So there's also there has been a thought that that we potentially are somehow more disposable, that because of our lack of worth, we're seen as being disposable to a society, and that we can be ignored. And we're often seen, we're viewed as leaners, not lifters, which came out of one of our politicians' mouths, sadly not that long ago. We're seen as takers from a system rather than givers, as a drain on society. And I know lots of disabled people who still talk about feeling like a burden to their families or to the world, and that is never a place that we want people to be or to feel. But these sorts of things have meant that disabled people have been treated without dignity, and that is still active. We're still forcibly incarcerated in institutions because we don't have a system that can support us to live outside of those institutions. We've been denied human rights, and Australia is a very strong perpetrator of lots of those human rights being violated. We've been deemed unfit parents. We've been denied reproductive rights, and we've been forced into poverty. We know, for example, that 45% of the disabled population in Australia lives at or below the poverty line. And we've been isolated by systemic discrimination. And I think it was really interesting during COVID, and Erin, I know you're going to talk about this a bit more, but there was something fascinating that happened when all of a sudden everybody needed to be online. Everybody needed to work from home. Everybody needed access to online education, or to visit a gallery, or to engage with the arts. And because everyone was perceived as being in that boat, then all of a sudden things happened overnight. Whereas the disability community had been told for years that this wasn't possible. That can't possibly happen. But miraculously it could happen overnight when the majority of the population also wanted to access life in that way. And I was at a conference just last week, actually, where someone was talking about COVID, because we did talk a lot about we're all in the same boat. And actually what this artist was saying was we were all in the same storm, but we weren't all in the same boat. And I think I feel like that was a really accurate and beautiful way of saying it, actually, because we all had our own unique experience of COVID, but we were all very much in that same storm. So we live with assumptions all the time. I regularly sit on the tram on my way to work as a CEO, and I often think, what do people think when they look at me? Are any of them thinking, she's off for a nice day out, maybe she's going to the cinema? Do any of them actually look at me and think, she's a CEO of an organisation that has a turnover of $4 million a year? Like, do they ever have that in their heads? Probably not. They're probably not thinking that. And I think I have a major issue with that. I think we need to be one of the biggest discriminating factors, I think, towards disabled people in the world is low expectation. And it can be one of the most debilitating things that we experience is that people expect so little of us. And we need to change that. Great. I want to we've been working through lots of concepts around cultural equity and around cultural safety, which is again a thing that emerged out of your fine shores over in Aotearoa. So we've been working a lot with people to take them through 10 steps to getting closer to cultural equity. And I would love to take them through, but I will just pull out a couple that I think are really significant and important for you to all be thinking about. And the first one is about doing some self-reflection. So in thinking about the structures that you might be in charge of, that you might work in, it's a really important thing to reflect on those structures and really think about how might those systems and structures have inbuilt ableism in them. How might those systems and structures be inadvertently discriminating against disabled people who might want to be joining your organization or working with you as a company? Really thinking about, questioning and actions and testing your unconscious bias. Really making sure that you're working from a social model perspective and a human rights perspective. So that idea that the medical model is the thing that puts the invisible label on our head when we get a diagnosis that supposedly tells people all sorts of things about us when actually it tells them nothing other than a big medical word that's attached to us. But if we think about the social model that flips that on its head, and the UN has a definition for disability, which is that disability results from an interaction between a non-inclusive society and an individual. So what it does is it takes the focus off the individual and puts it back onto society and really focuses on how we build disability in around us. And the best example that I can finish off on is by saying I can be more or less disabled depending on where I am in the world, and nothing about my physicality changes at all. But things that do change around me are the environment, a public transport system or a transport system, and primarily other people's attitudes. Really think through that that concept of how we building concept of ableism, or how can we move to a space of anti-ableism? How can we remove ableism from our systems and structures so that we can be more accessible, more open, more welcoming, and allow disabled people to take the lead. And at this point, I'd love to throw to Erin to bring your thoughts into it, so that, then we can chat about what we've come up with. So over to you, Erin.
Kia ora, Caroline. Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much. Look forward to chatting more soon. Kia ora, everyone. By way of introduction, I will just do a quick image description of myself. I'm a Pākehā person with dark blonde curly hair. I'm wearing a orange, red and black patterned dress with a bright purple cardigan, and I'm also in my own home office. I've got a stained glass window behind me and you can see some plants on a bookshelf. I'm zooming in from Te Whanganuiatara, Wellington. I'd just like to start by reading an excerpt from a piece of writing that I did a couple of years ago. So what's wrong with you then? The tone is as casual as the rest of our conversation about the dreary winter weather. Nothing, I say, pretending not to know what he is asking. I mean, he replies, gesticulating at my wheelchair. I was born, I state bluntly, trying to make the point that it's not the tragic accident he likely thinks it is. Here we go again, I think to myself. He raises his eyebrows expectantly. Don't crack, I tell myself. You don't owe him any information. You'll be justified in asking why he thinks such a question is okay. But the awkward silence is too much. Too early, I blurt. Brain damage. Affects my muscles. My answer opens a whole question time's worth of supplementary questions about how my body does or doesn't work. And though I want to raise a point of order about how it's really none of his bloody business, I'm not confident enough. They're all pretty innocuous in the scheme of things. Can I feel my legs? How long will I use the wheelchair? How fast does it go? At least he didn't ask if I can have sex this time. That's always fun. It's not. It's terrible. Still, the more he asks, the more I feel exposed, until I'm wearing nothing but an invisible coat of shame. I've worn this coat a lot in my 28 years. It's heavy, scratchy, uncomfortable, almost impossible to get out of, and yet the more I've worn it, the better it is fitted. Unlike other coats I wear, it has no regular pattern or colour scheme. Rather, it's made up of a mosaic of different sized, coloured and textured pieces of material woven together with assumptions about the capability, desirability and worthiness of my body. There's the run-of-the-mill, beige-coloured, what's wrong with you bits. The taxi encounter darns another one into the sleeve. The awkwardly placed, oddly shaped, unsolicited advice about how to fix my body bits. Yoga, this medication, a stranger's cousin with a completely different condition takes, prayer, and the razor-sharp, burning red patches. I like you, but I can't handle dating someone in a wheelchair. I'd kill myself if I was disabled. I aborted a disabled fetus once. Those ones hurt the most, no matter how many times I tried to blunt them. Some bits of material are decades old now, worn, faded, hidden under layers of others, sewn on when I was just a kid. Some are more recent. The shoulder pads of being in my 20s. Should have a partner, should start thinking about having children, padded with societal expectations. And some bits intersect with other features of my body. Pockets of fat jokes with ableist and anti-fat linings, double layered with two kinds of shade material. I wish I could say I've outgrown this coat of shame, but I haven't, not yet. But I've been working hard to replace it with better material. That was from a piece on RNZ a couple of years ago called Repairing an Invisible Coat of Shame. And I share it just as an example of some of the ableism that disabled people experience and the impact that they can have on people and the perception of themselves and how they navigate the world, and on myself in particular. And like Carolyn's very adeptly gone through, all of these things are kind of woven together with assumptions around the capability and worthiness of our bodies and our lives. And they can be very explicit as they are in that piece. And you might be thinking to yourself, God, I'd never say any of those things. That sounds bloody awful. And that might be true. But I guess the point I also want to make is that ableism can be a lot more subtle too. And Caroline touched on some in terms of assumptions when she's on the tram, going off to work, people making assumptions about what kind of things we get up to during our days, how inspirational it is for us to be out in the community. It could be in the language that we use, how often do we call someone an idiot or say something's driving us crazy or say something's falling on deaf ears. We might not even think about those things as ableist, but they're so ingrained into our culture and into our way of talking that people don't even notice that they're saying them. It might be in terms of tokenism. It might be getting in a disabled person to come and talk to your group of or your organization and then think, oh, great, that job's done for another year, and not really considering their lived experience as expertise or having any kind of way of building an ongoing relationship with them. Or it might be paternalism, thinking that people don't have the capacity to talk on behalf of themselves, and so need family members or friends to talk for them instead of putting an effort to support them to get their wills and preferences out into the world themselves. All of these things are examples of ableism. And for me, one of the great things about discovering ableism as a concept and things like the social model and disability justice, which Caroline touched on, was that it really brings a framework that I can understand my experiences through, and puts the focus on systems rather than on us as individuals. You know, my entire life I've been told that it's my body that's the problem, that I'm the one that needs to be fixed and work towards this panacea of normality. But ableism gives us a concept or a framework by which we can lift it up and look to why we experience the world the way that we do, and why people interact with us the way that we do, why our policies and laws and practices in the world are set up to, as Caroline touched on, discriminate and oppress us. And I think it's really summed up by this quote by a South African disability activist, Erin, who says, "Ableism doesn't just dehumanize disabled people, it strips non-disabled people of their own humanity. We're all harmed by the belief that there is one acceptable way of being human. Disabled people show us more beautiful, more expensive, more honest ways of being human." And I really like that quote because it speaks to, I guess, a strength-based view of disability, as Caroline said, and how we can have such incredible lives that from the outside people would never know about. And for me, it's also given a huge sense of community with other disabled people, being able to be in solidarity with them when we experience these acts of harm, acts of violence, and being able to just have someone who I know will be able to understand how that makes me feel, and the constant battle of being in a world that, as Caroline said, is not built for us in mind. This has been particularly apparent to me in the last couple of years with COVID, as Caroline touched on, and particularly in the last year or so, where the New Zealand government, like most of the governments in the world, have taken a very individualistic approach to COVID, given up on COVID protections, and kind of left people to fend for themselves. And as Caroline said, disabled people have obviously borne the brunt of that in terms of poor outcomes and deaths. And that's been a huge weight to carry, and has really exposed the depths and breadths of ableism in our public health systems. Alice Wong, who's another amazing disability activist in the US, I think summed it up well in 2020 when she wrote, "Many of us know the safety net has gaping holes and the state will not save us. So we're going to save ourselves with abundance, wisdom, joy, and love. Disabled people are not acceptable collateral damage in this pandemic. I want to believe that the future is not just mine, but ours. When one of us falls through the cracks, we all suffer. Time and ventilators are scarce, but we have the creativity, moral courage, and collective power to shape a world that has space for us all." And I just wanted to touch on that last sentence about having the creativity, moral courage, and collective power to shape a world that has space for us all, because I really think that that's the solution that we're talking about. That's what being anti-ableist really looks like. It's about taking small intentional actions often and collectively as a group to kind of try and shift these oppressive systems over a long period of time. And I just wanted to touch on some of the things that Caroline did in terms of cultural safety and equity, and building on those, and give some examples of things that I think non-disabled people in particular can do to be good allies and to work towards being anti-ableist. I think it's about reflecting on your own assumptions and biases about disability, and doing that often. Reading about, watching and listening to things about ableism and disability justice. I mean, there's so many amazing disability activists across the world who have taken the time and made the effort to put their thoughts out there. It's just waiting for people to consume it, really. And I think it's a gift that people often take for granted, that disability knowledge is out there. And so I really encourage you all to get your reading list together in that regard. I think it's about finding ways to challenge some of these negative assumptions we've talked about, so that disabled people don't always have to be the ones doing that. And the reality is, sadly, that in the ableist world that we live in, people are more likely, because of ableism, to listen to non-disabled people than they are to disabled people when we tell people about these things. And so being able to use your non-disabled privilege and the power that you have in those situations is really helpful. It's about raising accessibility issues. So when you go to an event, asking if it's accessible, and if not, asking why that isn't the case and what can be done about it to make it accessible. In the current context, it's also about looking at what the COVID protections are and thinking about how you can ensure that events are more COVID safe and accessible to inclusive to people in that way. It's about budgeting for accessibility and prioritizing it wherever possible. And if you're recruiting for jobs, for example, it's about making a commitment to accessibility and providing accommodations in addition to any language used on diversity. And on that note, I just wanted to also take the time to touch on this concept of diversity and talk about how we really need to go beyond that. There's another great quote that I found by Dr. Jennifer Lisa Best, which says, "Diversity is a word that does not offend, does not highlight inequality, does not refer to historical injustices or point the finger or lay blame. Diversity has a certain neutrality about it that makes it palatable. Without explicit dialogue and action on ending oppression and privilege, diversity programs cannot change racist, sexist, homophobic, and ableist beliefs and practices." And I think that's really important because it speaks to how, again, sometimes these words and these concepts can be thrown around and people can be well-intentioned, but ultimately it's a token effort because there's no effort put into building relationships with people in an ongoing way and actually respecting their expertise. And so I guess that's the last point that I want to touch on, is looking to disabled people for leadership. So sponsoring projects, forming partnerships, and getting involved with community-based disability organizations in a meaningful way, putting effort into building relationships and keeping them. And I just wanted to finish off on another quote by another amazing disability activist, Mia Mingus, who in a blog post last year talked about this concept of able supremacy and the need to be in solidarity with disabled people. I think this really sums up what we've kind of been talking about in terms of working to be anti-ableist and what people can do and what that looks like. She says, "If there was ever a time to be in solidarity with disabled people, it is now. It has been through this entire pandemic. This is about what you can do now. Now is the time to recalibrate, to get back in alignment with your values. We don't need your apologies. We don't have time for that. We just need you to do better. If you are abled, talk to other abled people. Because of ableism, they will be more open to hearing it from you than from us. Help to educate them. Do not participate in upholding ableist supremacy. Unlearn everything that doesn't serve interdependence." Interdependence is ultimately about we instead of me. It understands that we are bound together by virtue of existing on this planet. Interdependence is generative and grounded in care for one another. It doesn't live in obligation or entitlement, but rather a loving willingness and a sacred giving. Interdependence cannot exist in scarcity, competition, comparison, domination, or greed. It flourishes in abundance, appreciating and honoring difference, collective care, and collective access. Interdependence can exist between two people or 6 billion and everything in between. So I really wanted to just leave it on that note and to thank you all for being here, for connecting with us. And I guess I would just implore for us to keep working together, to keep being interdependent on one another, and to ignite possibilities so that we can have a more inclusive, more accessible, less ableist world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin. That was amazing, and I want access to every one of those quotes because I think there's something so important about being able to bring other disabled voices into these spaces, and I think we're getting better at that, is that thought of we don't just come as a solo person, but actually we come with all of this wisdom. I call it crip wisdom. Like, we come with all of this wisdom that sits around us, and you just bringing those quotes so generously is just like, oh my gosh. Yeah, really amazing. Thank you so much. And for such really clear actions that people can take. I'm really keen, while we just chat, because I've got a million questions that I want to ask you, but I want to invite other people that might be in the space or watching to put some questions in the chat, and they'll be fed through to us. But I wanted to pick up on your point about putting your reading lists together. And because I think that's true, and I think there's something really important about finding those authentic voices. And how do you find those authentic voices? Like, how do you pull those people out? Where do you find them?
Yeah, I guess for me, I've taken it for granted that I've had, like you say, this amazing community of people that I can draw on. For me, social media has been a game changer. Twitter in particular, there's a huge community of disability activists on there who very generously share their thoughts on pretty much everything, as you do on Twitter. And that's really where I've built up this kind of knowledge base that I can draw on. So I think just for people to be able to go on social media and start following some disabled people who have this public profile would be a good start.
Yeah. Who would be at the top of your list? I've got a few that I can throw into the thoughts. But who's...
Well, speaking of a great Australian who I miss very, very much, Stella Young always comes to mind. She has an amazing TED talk that I would recommend everyone check out called "Thank You for Your Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much," and that really helped shift my thinking about inspiration porn in particular. She passed away maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, but I still very much draw on her wisdom and on her writing. And I guess that's one of the things to note as well is unfortunately, because disabled people might die younger, there's a huge range of what I call kind of crip ancestors where all this wisdom's been kind of built from that, I still go back and draw on even now. So she's one of them. I would say Alice Wong, who I had a few quotes from in that piece, is another. She's recently released a memoir earlier this year that's just come out. Mia Mingus, who I read from the last quote, she has an amazing blog with just her thoughts, but the way that she writes is so compelling and just makes me think in this kind of systems way that means that I have some kind of hope for the future, and then I'm not weighed down by all these individual things that happen to us as disabled people out in the world. So yeah, that's just a few, but there's so many that I can think of. How about yourself?
Alice Wong, absolutely, and I love Alice's podcast as well. I've been getting into podcasts, so and there's a few great ones that are out there. I'm in the process of doing lots of audiobooks at the moment because they're an easier way for me to access reading, as it were. And I started reading a book called Sitting Pretty by Rebecca Tusing, and Rebecca just has a way with words that have really, a bit like you were saying about ableism gives us a structure to understand why people behave the way they do. And I feel like there were lots of things in this book called Sitting Pretty that I was reading that really just resonated for me. And I just wanted to share a couple of quotes from this book called Sitting Pretty that I highly recommend people get a hold of. As disabled people, we are circus performers riding bikes over tight ropes, juggling oranges while singing opera, and we make it all look natural and easy. We have the impossible, relentless task of making other people feel comfortable with our disability, of helping them see us as human without making them feel threatened or shamed, and it's stunningly familiar. Disabled people are expected to cope with their own social ostracism, to handle being misunderstood or misrepresented, and at the same time put at ease those who perform the ostracism. So it's like, whoa, when I kind of heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so accurate.
Yeah.
I think Mia Mingus has a beautiful, they have an amazing blog that's called Leaving Evidence, and there is a piece of writing that Mia wrote in 2014 that is called Leaving Evidence, and it has been really active in my creative practice over the last couple of years because it's about the significance of how important it is for us to leave evidence of our existence, because we could be completely made invisible. And I think there was a lot of fear about that through COVID, is that we could be made to feel invisible.
Absolutely. One of the things that Alice Wong and a couple of others have started is called the Oracle Project, and they've talked about how disabled people are often oracles because we can kind of see the future and what's coming, because we're this tragic future that might happen to you if you're lucky enough to live long enough, and how that kind of means that we can think about things that other people kind of just pretend don't exist. And COVID has been a prime example of that, and continues to be a prime example of that. So that's something else that I would encourage people to check out. Like, there's just so much out there that, like, you could just have a session on getting a reading list or a watch list together, I reckon. And that rich resource is really under-tapped, I think.
Yeah, completely. There are so many. You're right. Are you happy for us to consider a couple of questions that have come in?
Great.
Yeah. So Amy here we go. Lucky I've got my glasses on, but I'm going to just read out the first one, which is, taking a point about ableism being racism for people with disabilities. What are your thoughts and work done in Australia on the intersectional space? Have you approached it with different cultural perspectives, lenses? I'm happy to have a go at that first, Erin, and then maybe you want to. And I think, thanks for your question. It's the intersections. One of the things that I regularly say is disabled people are never just one thing. We are not just one identity. We are all intersectional beings. And I think we are very much in a process of trying to there is so much to learn from our First Nations people in this country, specifically about self-determination is a huge thing that I have learned more and more about, very our ancestry and where we come from. And I think there is still a very tight coat of shame around some cultural groups in relation to disability. I think maybe that's changing slowly, but for a long time, it was a place of shame for many cultural groups, I would say. So we are on that path and engaging people, and I think it's changing. But yes, absolutely want to acknowledge that we are never just one thing. and we are bringing different perspectives because of the other cultures that or other cultural groups that we come from. Erin, do you want to add anything in?
Yeah, sure. Picking up on that point, one of the things that I really like about the disability justice framework is that focus on intersectionality and acknowledging that as well as areas of oppression, we have areas of privilege as well. And that's something that I always try to keep in mind, particularly as a white disabled person who is well educated and middle class. I have a lot of privileges that other disabled people who don't inhabit those spaces don't have. And so it's my responsibility to use that privilege appropriately and to acknowledge that privilege where I can and to work on my own reflection in those spaces. I think it's important to acknowledge. And something I also like about the disability justice framework is this idea that we need to centre the most impacted. So we need to look at, where people who experience the intersections of oppression the most, how we can kind of ensure that they're supported and that the focus is on liberating them, because if we can focus on the most impacted, then everyone else kind of benefits as a result. Yeah.
That's such a great point. Thank you. Erin, do you want to take the next question? Do you want to choose?
Yeah, it says, there's one that says, how do you approach the issue of people using their disability as an excuse to not be as independent as possible? Professionally, as a workplace, we promote artists' independence. I think that's an interesting framing around independence. I think Mia Mingus in her blog, actually, the one that I read out, says that independence is kind of a myth from abled culture in a way, because, again, like there's this drive for people to be these individual, kind of self-sufficient, quote unquote, human beings. But I think it is really about interdependence and being able to look at how we can use each other's skills and knowledge and strengths to support one another. So I guess one of the questions that comes to mind when I read that question is, what support do the artists that you're talking about need to feel like they can share that knowledge and skills within that context? Do you have any thoughts, Caroline?
No, I would agree. I think there's something really interesting about the concept of independence, and I think that's absolutely what. Yeah, I think it's also. I think we need to be using the concept of interdependence more than we currently are. I think.
I guess another thing I would say is. It's like I can think back in my experience of life and have situations where I've not been given the opportunity to be independent because people have assumptions about what I can and can't do. And so maybe for people, it's also about being given the dignity to be given chances to demonstrate how they would like to be independent as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's in dialogue, really. It's and what independence looks like to one person is completely different to another. And for some people to achieve the greatest independence, they might need support in a specific area or whatever it might be. So I think dialogue is essential in that space.
Did you want to read out the next question?
Yeah, sure. So Anonymous has said, yesterday's panel discussion addressed ways of leading that could bring about transformational change for Māori, e.g. shift from traditional autocratic styles. What does transformational leadership look like for you in this space? Erin, I feel like you've already said it. For me, it's about, I kind of have a bit of a mantra that I've had since I came into this role, which is about making space, holding space, and taking space. And for me, I think as a leader in I suppose of the organisation, but also in the sector, I would say that a major part of my role is about concentrating on how I'm making space for others to step into. So how am I making space for people to step in and have a voice? And how am I ensuring that the people that are stepping in are the ones that are the most marginalised, for want of a better term? So the ones that are at the centre of the multiple intersections. How do I hold space? Recently at Alter State, I was described by one of the disabled artists as being a door wedge. So it was a bit like I'd wedged myself in the door at Arts Centre Melbourne and was just kind of bringing lots of disabled voices into that space. And I'm very happy to be a door wedge, I must say. But I think that idea about holding space so that other voices can be heard. And then also how, in terms of taking space, how are we encouraging people to step up into those spaces? How are we encouraging people to really know that their voice is important in that space and have a willingness to take that space and share their wisdom, is what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I really like the concept of a door wedge. I might take that one for myself.
Absolutely.
Sharing disability knowledge. For me, I think you said it really well, covering those three areas in terms of making and taking space as well. I'm trying to think if I have anything. I was going to say, I think it's about kind of looking at different ways of doing things, and just because something's been done for a particular way for a long time doesn't mean that that's how things always have to be. I, in my day job for my sins, work in government, so that's a very present part of my day is trying to challenge systems where things have been done and set up a particular way and done that way for a long time, just on the basis of convention, but trying to kind of push for more innovative ways of doing things, or bringing in concepts like crip time and not always being driven by deadlines or this very linear concept of time is always helpful for me. And just thinking about different ways that we can involve different people at different levels and kind of utilize, again, their strengths and skills and knowledge in a way that's really affirming for them is something that I'd like to do more of as well.
Yeah, amazing. I just wanted to pick up, Erin, on something that you just said about the jobs we have for our sins, whatever. I love that the thought of you for your sins have to work for government. But I think there's something really important about the jobs that disabled people take on in the world. So for you and I, we are not just the role that we have, but we are also handed invisibly, without any kind of contract sign up. We are also there to educate, to inspire, to motivate, to do all of these other things that I think is a weight that, as disabled people, visibly disabled people, comfortably proud disabled people, we also, there's an expectation that we will take that on. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that. Acknowledge the weight of our coats of shame that we carry, that we haven't actually selected for ourselves, but we've just been given them like gifts somehow from the world. So I think we need to acknowledge we're all carrying that coat of shame with us wherever we go.
And people's expectations as well. I mean, one of the things that I constantly face in my job. For context, I work in a kind of policy space, which is this disability focus as well. So obviously, as a disabled person, I have particular personal investment in that space, but then for the purposes of my job, often have to navigate spaces where non-disabled people are working on these disability-specific issues, and we need non-disabled allies in those spaces. But
Completely.
it still means that, unlike them who can switch off after 5 o'clock and go home, I still have to deal with the logistics of getting home, all the accessibility barriers that you face just as a disabled person navigating the world. And then on top of that, there's sometimes a conflict between what I'm working on in my day job and also the expectations of the disability community. And so trying to navigate all of those things is very, very tough sometimes, I will say.
Yeah, it's big, isn't it? Like, to be viewed as the voice, like sometimes I can be viewed as the voice for 4.4 million people. Who else is ever asked to do that? I mean, sometimes as women, we speak on behalf of all women, which we know is a fallacy. But I think there is a thing about, if you are an out, proud disabled person, that you carry the wishes, desires, ambitions of every other disabled person in the world sometimes.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure to put on one person.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people don't have that in their consciousness about when they might ask a seemingly trivial question sometimes. It's like, well, this is from my perspective, but if you asked any other, I regularly talk about the fact that there is the same bell curve within the disability community as is in any other part of society. So there will be people at either extreme. There will be really friendly, happy, jovial disabled people, and there'll be really grumpy, sad.
Well, I guess that's like the nature of ableism, though, because we're not seen as these complex human beings with our own opinions and desires and different perspectives of the world. We're seen as very one-dimensional.
Yes.
Oh, that person's a wheelchair user, so this is the kind of cookie-cutter wheelchair user, you know.
I've met one of them before.
Yeah.
Oh, you've met one of them before, not all. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Really interesting.
I think we have another question that's going to be brought up.
Yeah, great.
This is just from Tracy, who says, would love to see a list of your reading list authors and your quotes. I can't take notes fast enough. We'll spell some partly heard names. Thanks for this amazing corridor this morning. Yeah, sure, I can send you send through the quotes that I used.
That would be great, and I can send through some stuff as well, and then maybe Amy and the team can pull it together and share it with everybody else.
Yeah, sounds good. I wanted to ask, as someone who is a CEO, a head of an organization, how do you kind of navigate a sector where there's so many different interests, or there might be a combination of disabled or non-disabled artists that you're dealing with, or like how do you navigate all those spaces?
I would say I do a lot of listening. I would say I do a lot of listening and learning from community and from the disabled artists that we work with. And every day is every day is a school day. And then I think what I've been doing with the sector is really being much more explicit about the experience of people. Talking much more about the cultural context of disability and where it sits in the world, and bringing the conversations of ableism, because I think that had been missing for a long time. And I think there is, as there is everywhere, there is a lot of work still to do. But I like to think that I really listen, and I try to kind of feed back to people through the filter of where the sticking points are. And I ask a lot of questions, Erin. I think that's the thing, is I don't expect myself to have the answers, but what I do expect to have is a lot of questions. And I think that learning came from when I had a role a long time, well, not a long time ago, 2008 to 2012, I had a role as a dance agent for change with a mainstream contemporary dance company in Scotland. And my job was to perform with the company and to teach as part of the teaching team, and to basically look at the systems. Like, it was multifaceted role. And ultimately it was to affect the artistic landscape in Scotland. Just a little thing,
just a small
during
role,
the spare time. But I think in that I really picked up on the thing that you were saying before. I would ask why a lot. Why is the system set up like this? Because that's the way it's always been. So is there a purpose? Like, is there a reason that it needs to be set up in that way? And it was kind of, I would interrogate things with people without blame. Like, I think that's a super important thing in this space, is that this isn't about blame. This isn't about a witch hunt, but it is about really bringing into focus how systemic barriers are being built every day. And I suppose also letting people know the impact that they're having on people. So your text, your beautiful text about your coat of shame, if more people heard that and thought about that and knew that happened to us all the time, I think people would shift in their thinking. I think people would potentially think before they asked or before they acted. And that's always one of the things that I say to people, is always ask before you act, and ensure that we are in those conversations, and don't just invite us in a tokenistic way to be in those conversations, but pay people to be in those conversations, acknowledge the wisdom and the experience that those people are bringing, that we're bringing, communities bringing to that table, and take it seriously. Because I think also people can hear things and be told things, but as Mia's, I think it was Mia's last quote said, oh no, it was the one about diversity. What a joyous word. That thing about, you can talk about diversity till the cows come home, but until it actually addresses the oppression and takes steps to change it, it's, I don't know, it's really unhelpful.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing all that. I think for me, it's also about, I don't know, we internalize a lot of these things. Like, I constantly find that I have to like challenge the assumptions about myself and like my experience of the world, and we often, I think, can doubt ourselves because of all these, oppressive interactions and systems and structures, and it's a constant kind of pushing back against that as well.
Yeah, and I think we don't talk about that. Like, we know, as humans, we know we take on so much from the world, almost by osmosis, that tells us things about ourselves that aren't true. But I think the concept of internalized ableism and the self-hatred that regularly can grow from something like that, the fact that we start to believe that we don't belong because lots of things in the world are telling us that we're wrong or we're inconvenient or whatever, we start to believe that, and that's a lot to undo.
That's a lifetime of work. One of the quotes that I absolutely hate, like, no offense to RuPaul, but like I absolutely hate the quote, before you can love anyone else, you have to love yourself. Because I'm like, if you're getting all these messages about how you're wrong and you need to be fixed and you don't deserve to exist in the world, then of course you're gonna not love yourself. Being able to love yourself is a privilege that lots of people don't have. And so that's something that I also have to remind myself. The solution isn't in self-love, it's in collective liberation and working towards a more just world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to share a quote that's, as well as being described as a door wedge, I've regularly been described as a mosquito. Buzzing in the ear of the arts industry. And I think the reason that came or emerged was at the end of my role as Dance Agent for Change, and it was attached to a quote that's been awarded to many people. Everyone from the Dalai Lama through to Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop, has been quoted as saying this, but it is that thought of if you think you're too small to make a difference, you've never tried to go to sleep with a mosquito in the room.
Yeah.
And it's that, for me, it's that concept of we all have the potential to bring about change. But it takes determination and it takes work, and we need to not do it solo. And I think that is one of the things that's super important to me about disability community, is that we work together and we support each other and we carry each other's words in our head and in our being. So we all have the potential for change, and I would say to allies in the space, be informed, be educated, educate yourselves, and really listen. When you have the privilege of meeting a disabled colleague or person, really listen, deeply listen.